The owner of the cafe chased the thirsty child away, not knowing who the mother was. What happened next amazed everyone. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and don't miss other stories that are waiting for you here. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air of the White Lily, a cafe nestled in the heart of the city's affluent district. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished wooden tables, and the hum of conversation blended with the soft clinking of porcelain cups. Every detail of the cafe had been meticulously curated by its owner, Mrs. Harper. From the artfully arranged lilies on each table to the impeccable uniforms of her staff, the place was a shrine to her vision of refinement. Mrs. Harper herself sat behind the counter, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. She prided herself on maintaining the cafe's reputation as a sanctuary for the city's elite. Her customers were lawyers, executives, and socialites, people she believed embodied success and sophistication. Mrs. Harper had, a tall woman with tightly coiffed silver hair and a perpetual air of authority, had built her business on exclusivity, ensuring that only the right kind of people felt welcome. Behind the counter, one of her baristas, a young woman named Monica, fumbled with an order. A drop of espresso splattered onto the pristine counter. "Monica!" Mrs. Harper's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. "How many times must I tell you? Precision is everything here. Our clients expect excellence, not mediocrity." Monica mumbled an apology, her cheeks flushing red. She hurried to wipe away the offending stain as Mrs. Harper turned her attention back to the cafe floor, scanning for any signs of imperfection. Outside, the sun blazed, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. A boy of about 10 lingered near the entrance, his dark skin glistening with sweat under the summer heat. His clothes, though clean, were simple, faded jeans and a plain t-shirt. He clutched a worn backpack and glanced hesitantly at the cafe. The ornate lettering of "The White Lily" on the door seemed almost like a warning sign, but thirst and exhaustion pushed him forward. Jaden stepped inside, the sudden coolness of the air-conditioned space washing over him. He hesitated near the counter, feeling the weight of the stares from the well-dressed patrons. Conversations faltered as some customers gave him quick, dismissive glances. Jaden's gaze dropped to the floor, but he mustered the courage to approach the counter. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. Monica leaned down to hear him better. "Hi there, what can I get for you?" "Can I have some water, please?" Jaden asked, his voice trembling slightly. Before Monica could respond, Mrs. Harper appeared at her side. Her presence was immediate and commanding, and Monica straightened instinctively. "We don't serve free water," Mrs. Harper said, her lips tightening into a thin line. She looked Jaden over, her gaze lingering disapprovingly on his worn sneakers. "This is not a charity." Jaden blinked, stunned by her tone. I just need a drink," he stammered. Mrs. Harper's voice grew louder, cutting through the quiet of the cafe. "If you're not buying anything, you need to leave. This is a place of business, young man." The room fell silent. Jaden could feel every eye in the cafe on him, some curious, others indifferent, and a few openly hostile. His cheeks burned with humiliation. He opened his mouth to plead, but stopped when Mrs. Harper crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, daring him to argue. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, turning to leave. As he walked away, he could hear a murmur of disapproval ripple through the room. "Good riddance," one patron whispered to another. "Honestly, the nerve," another added. Outside, Jaden paused to catch his breath, his chest tight with a mix of shame and anger. He wiped at his eyes, though no tears had fallen, and began the long walk home. Miriam Williams was reviewing documents at the dining table when Jaden entered the small but tidy apartment they shared. She immediately noticed his slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. "Jaden," she called, setting down her pen. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Jaden hesitated, biting his lower lip. "Nothing," he muttered, but his voice betrayed him. Miriam got up and walked over to him, crouching so she was eye level with her son. "Hey," she said gently. "You can tell me. What happened?" Jaden sighed and recounted his experience at the White Lily. He described the cafe, Mrs. Harper, and the way she had dismissed him so easily. As he spoke, his voice wavered and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Miriam listened silently, her expression shifting from concern to anger. By the time Jaden finished, her jaw was tight and her eyes blazed with determination. "She said what to you?" Miriam's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Jaden had rarely heard before. "It's fine, Mom," Jaden said quickly. "I don't want to cause trouble." "It's not fine," Miriam replied firmly. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her voice softening. "No one has the right to treat you like that. Ever." Jaden looked at her, his eyes full of doubt. "But what can we do? She owns the place. She can do whatever she wants." Miriam stood, her mind already racing. Maybe she owns that cafe, but she doesn't own this city, and she's about to learn that actions have consequences. Jaden watched as his mother retrieved her phone and began making calls. For the first time that day, a small spark of hope flickered in his chest. The next morning, the city awoke to another bright, blistering day, but inside the White Lily, the atmosphere was far from sunny. The cafe bustled with its usual clientele, men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses, all sipping coffee and discussing deals or gossip. Mrs. Harper moved through the room with her usual precision, inspecting every table and offering polite smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Yet she couldn't shake the faint unease lingering from the day before. Something about that boy, the audacity, the nerve of him entering her establishment, still irritated her. But what irked her more was the subtle shift in the room after she'd thrown him out. Some patrons had looked disapproving, though none had said anything outright. Mrs. Harper dismissed it as inconsequential. Her rules were clear, and she would not apologize for enforcing them. The chime of the cafe door opening interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Harper turned toward the entrance, prepared to greet another regular, but her polite smile faltered. A tall woman in a sharply tailored suit stepped inside. Her dark brown skin gleamed under the cafe's soft lighting, and her presence commanded immediate attention. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her chin held high as she scanned the room. Miriam Williams approached the counter without hesitation, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't fit the typical profile of a White Lily customer, and the patrons took notice. Murmurs rippled through the cafe as eyes followed her every step. "Good morning," Miriam said, her voice calm and steady as she addressed Monica at the counter. "Good morning," Monica replied, though her voice carried a hint of nervousness. "What can I get for you?" "Actually, I'd like to speak with the owner," Miriam said, glancing briefly at the name tag pinned to Monica's uniform. "Is Mrs. Harper available?" Before Monica could respond, Mrs. Harper appeared from behind the counter. Her sharp gaze landed on Miriam, and her smile returned, though it was colder than before. "You're speaking to her," Mrs. Harper said, her tone clipped but polite. "How can I help you?" Miriam turned to face her fully, meeting her eyes with unwavering confidence. I'd like to discuss an incident that occurred here yesterday." Mrs. Harper's expression tightened slightly, but she quickly recovered. "I see. And what incident would that be?" "My son, Jaden, came here yesterday," Miriam said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "He was thirsty and asked for a glass of water. Instead of showing him the basic decency of providing it, you humiliated him and forced him to leave." Mrs. Harper stiffened, her back straightening as a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Ah, yes," she said, her tone growing defensive. "I remember. Your son came in without any intention of purchasing something. We are a business, not a public water station." Miriam's gaze didn't waver. "A business, yes, but also part of this community. Providing a glass of water to a child on a hot day is hardly a threat to your profits." "I don't appreciate being lectured in my own establishment," Mrs. Harper replied sharply, her mask of civility slipping slightly. She crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. "If you're here to make a scene, I suggest you leave." Miriam allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of her presence settle over the room. The patrons, previously engaged in their own conversations, now watched with open curiosity. "I'm not here to make a scene, Mrs. Harper," Miriam said finally. "I'm here to inform you of a few facts. First, I own the building your cafe is located in. That means I'm your landlord." Mrs. Harper's face froze, her mask cracking further. For a moment she seemed unsure how to respond, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. "And second," Miriam continued, her voice unwavering, "I've reviewed the terms of your lease. Let's just say it might be time for a re-evaluation." The color drained from Mrs. Harper's face, though she quickly attempted to regain her composure. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You would jeopardize my business over something so trivial?" "Trivial?" Miriam's voice sharpened. "You humiliated a child. My child, for no reason other than your own prejudice. That's not trivial, Mrs. Harper. That's unacceptable." For a moment, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. Miriam stood tall and composed, while Mrs. Harper struggled to maintain her veneer of control. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Mrs. Harper forced a brittle smile. "I see we've had a misunderstanding," she said, her voice coated in a forced sweetness. "Perhaps we can discuss this privately?" Miriam tilted her head slightly, as though considering the offer. "Perhaps," she said, "but I'll leave you with this. Actions have consequences, Mrs. Harper. You may want to reflect on that before we meet again." Without another word, Miriam turned and walked out of the cafe, her heels echoing against the floor. The patrons watched her go, and the room slowly returned to its usual hum of conversation, though the energy had undeniably shifted. Mrs. Harper remained behind the counter, her mind racing. The crack in her mask had been exposed, and for the first time in years, she felt the unfamiliar sting of vulnerability. She would have to tread carefully. Miriam Williams wasn't someone to be underestimated. But Mrs. Harper didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning. The evening air carried a cool breeze as Miriam sat in her modest apartment, her laptop glowing faintly on the table before her. A cup of tea, untouched and cooling, sat beside a stack of notes. Her son Jaden had gone to bed hours ago, though Miriam knew he wasn't sleeping soundly. The humiliation he had endured lingered in his mind, igniting a fire within her chest. Miriam scrolled through property records, her gaze sharp as she studied every detail of the cafe's lease agreement. She had already known her ownership gave her leverage, but tonight she wanted more than leverage. She wanted justice. Mrs. Harper's condescending tone replayed in her mind, each word stoking her determination. Picking up her phone, Miriam dialed the number of a lawyer she had worked with in the past, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Tate. "Evelyn, it's Miriam," she said as soon as the call connected. "I need your expertise." After explaining the situation, Evelyn's response was quick and confident. "If what you're saying is true, there's plenty we can do. But I'll need evidence, something solid that shows a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Can you find any witnesses, former employees?" "I'll start digging," Miriam replied, her resolve hardening, "and I won't stop until I have enough." The next morning, Miriam set to work. She began by researching reviews of the White Lily, combing through complaints that hinted at the treatment of minority customers or employees. There weren't many. Mrs. Harper had been careful to maintain her outward image, but a few negative reviews stood out, recounting instances of rudeness and unprofessionalism that seemed oddly consistent. One review in particular caught Miriam's attention. A man named Carlos had written about his time working as a line cook at the cafe, mentioning that he had quit after being treated like less than human. Miriam jotted down his name and moved on to others, constructing a list of potential witnesses. Her next call was to a private investigator she had hired once before for business disputes. His name was David Holt, a methodical man with a knack for uncovering hidden truths. When Miriam explained the situation, David immediately agreed to help. "I'll start by tracking down the names you've given me," he said, "and I'll see if there's anything else about Mrs. Harper's business practices worth looking into." 2 days later, David called with his first report. Miriam listened intently as he detailed the stories he had uncovered. "Carlos Fernandez," David began, "worked as a line cook at the White Lily for about 2 years. He says Mrs. Harper frequently insulted him in front of customers and staff, calling him slow and unprofessional. He claims she also docked his pay for minor mistakes, which were often exaggerated." Miriam clenched her jaw. "Does he have proof of these pay deductions?" Possibly. He kept some old pay stubs. I'm meeting him tomorrow to collect copies." David continued. "Then there's Monica Green, a former barista. She worked there for 6 months before quitting. She says Mrs. Harper constantly belittled her appearance, telling her she needed to look more polished to serve their clientele. She also witnessed Mrs. Harper refusing service to several customers who didn't fit her idea of appropriate." Miriam took notes as David spoke, each story reinforcing her anger. "What about current employees?" she asked. "I'm still working on that," David admitted. "The ones I've approached so far are hesitant to talk. They're afraid of losing their jobs." "That's understandable," Miriam said. "But if we can prove a pattern of behavior, their fear might become courage." Later that week, Miriam met with Carlos at a small diner on the outskirts of town. He was a stocky man in his 40s, his hands rough from years of kitchen work. Despite his gruff exterior, he spoke with surprising vulnerability as he recounted his time at the White Lily. "She'd yell at me in front of everyone," Carlos said, his voice low but steady. "I was always too slow, too messy, too... something. She treated me like I didn't belong there, no matter how hard I worked." He slid a folder across the table. "These are the pay stubs I kept. You can see where she docked my pay without explanation." Miriam flipped through the documents, her stomach churning as she noted the discrepancies. "Thank you, Carlos. This is going to help a lot." Carlos nodded, though his expression remained grim. "Just make sure she doesn't get away with it. For all the others, she's treated like dirt." "I will," Miriam promised. Monica Green was next. Miriam met her in a park where Monica was playing with her young daughter, and Monica was younger than Miriam had expected, barely out of her 20s, with a weary look in her eyes that spoke of too many battles fought too early. "Working for Mrs. Harper was awful," Monica said, as they sat on a bench. "She'd nitpick everything, my hair, my makeup, even the way I smiled, and she'd always make comments about customers who didn't fit the brand." Monica hesitated, glancing at her daughter. There was one time she refused service to a woman because she thought her clothes were too cheap. She didn't even bother lowering her voice. The poor woman left in tears. Miriam reached out and placed a hand on Monica's arm. "You're brave for speaking up. Thank you." Monica nodded, though she still looked uncertain. "Do you really think it'll make a difference?" "Yes," Miriam said firmly. "It will." By the end of the week, Miriam had compiled a growing stack of evidence: witness testimonies, pay stubs, and written complaints. Each piece painted a damning picture of Mrs. Harper's behavior, a pattern of discrimination and cruelty that could no longer be ignored. Sitting in her living room late one night, Miriam reviewed the files, her heart heavy but determined. She thought of Jaden, asleep in the next room, and the countless others who had suffered under Mrs. Harper's arrogance. "This is only the beginning," she murmured to herself. "She's built her empire on the backs of others, and it's time for that empire to fall." With that, Miriam sent an email to Evelyn, attaching everything she had gathered. As she hit send, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The voices of the past were finally being heard, and soon they would bring Mrs. Harper's carefully constructed facade crashing down. The morning sun spilled over the city as the first article about the White Lily went live. Published by a popular local news outlet, the headline read, "Exclusive Cafe or Hostile Workplace. Former Employees Speak Out." The article detailed the testimonies of former workers like Carlos and Monica, painting a vivid picture of Mrs. Harper's abusive behavior and discriminatory practices. It also mentioned Miriam Williams as the building owner, hinting at the possibility of legal repercussions for the cafe. By midday, the story was already spreading. Social media buzzed with comments, retweets, and debates. Some defended Mrs. Harper, claiming the article was exaggerated, while others expressed outrage, sharing their own experiences of being treated poorly at the cafe. The hashtag #BoycottWhiteLily began trending locally. Inside the cafe, Mrs. Harper was oblivious, at least for a moment. She greeted her regulars as usual, though the turnout seemed slightly lower than expected. The staff moved about their tasks, their faces tense, as though waiting for something to explode. The tension in the air was palpable. The first clue came when Monica, now a barista at another cafe, sent a text to one of her former coworkers. "Have you seen the news? Harper's finally getting what she deserves." The coworker, a timid young woman named Anna, glanced at her phone and immediately turned pale. She tried to focus on her work, but the words from the article swirled in her mind. She had stayed silent about Mrs. Harper's behavior for fear of losing her job, but now her co-worker's courage seemed contagious. By early afternoon, customers began trickling out, murmuring among themselves as they read the article on their phones. Mrs. Harper noticed the sudden exodus and frowned. "Is something going on?" she asked Anna, her voice sharp. Anna hesitated. I think there's something online about the cafe." Mrs. Harper's brow furrowed as she pulled out her phone. Her expression darkened as she scanned the article, her fingers trembling slightly. Her name, her cafe, dragged through the mud for the entire city to see. She gripped the phone tightly and stormed toward the counter. "Anna," she snapped, "did you know about this?" "No," Anna stammered, shrinking back. I saw it this morning." Mrs. Harper's lips thinned into a hard line. "Get back to work," she said, her voice icy. She turned to the rest of the staff. "All of you, stop standing around and focus on your jobs. We have customers to serve." The staff obeyed, but the usual rhythm of the cafe was broken. Conversations between customers grew louder, their words drifting to Mrs. Harper's ears. "Did you read what she did to that boy? It's disgusting. I'm never coming back here." Her chest tightened, a rare flicker of panic threatening to crack her composed exterior, but she refused to show weakness. She was Mrs. Harper, the owner of The White Lily. No article, no gossip, no disgruntled employees could bring her down. Or so she thought. That evening, the cafe was nearly empty, a stark contrast to its usual bustling atmosphere. Mrs. Harper sat at her desk in the back office, her laptop open to the article. She read it again, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. How dare they accuse her of such things? She had built this business with her own hands, creating a space of refinement and elegance. If some people couldn't meet her standards, that wasn't her fault. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from one of her longtime suppliers. "Due to recent allegations, we're suspending our partnership until further notice." Her hands tightened into fists as she stared at the screen. Another message came through, this time from a friend. "I saw the article. Are you okay? Let me know if you want to talk." The pity in those words burned. Mrs. Harper didn't need pity, she needed loyalty. But as the hours dragged on, the messages kept coming, each one driving home the reality she refused to accept. Her reputation was crumbling. The next day, Miriam sat in a cafe across town, her laptop open as she read the growing wave of reactions online. Evelyn had been right. The evidence was damning, and the public wasn't letting it slide. Miriam felt a mix of satisfaction and resolve. This was only the beginning. She sipped her coffee, scrolling through comments. One caught her attention. "I used to love that place, but now I feel gross forever going there." Another read, "Why are places like this still allowed to operate? Shut it down." A notification popped up, a direct message from an anonymous account. Miriam opened it and found a lengthy message from someone claiming to be a current employee of the White Lily. The message detailed more instances of harassment and unfair treatment, but the sender expressed fear of speaking out publicly. "I'll protect your anonymity," Miriam typed back. "If you're willing to provide more details, your story could help make a difference." The reply came quickly. "I'll think about it." Miriam closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. She knew this wasn't over yet. Mrs. Harper wouldn't go down without a fight. Back at the White Lily, Mrs. Harper's worst fears were realized when a customer openly confronted her. A middle-aged woman in a neatly pressed blazer stood at the counter, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you Mrs. Harper?" the woman asked. "Yes," Mrs. Harper replied, her tone curt. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to know if the allegations in that article are true," the woman said, crossing her arms. "Because if they are, I'll never set foot in this place again." Mrs. Harper forced a tight smile. "I assure you, those claims are completely baseless. My cafe is a place of excellence and professionalism." "Is that so?" the woman countered. "Then why are there so many stories saying otherwise?" Before Mrs. Harper could respond, the woman turned and left, her footsteps echoing in the now silent cafe. The remaining customers exchanged glances before following suit, leaving Mrs. Harper standing alone behind the counter. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. That night, as Mrs. Harper locked the doors to her cafe, she noticed a group of teenagers loitering across the street, their phones glowing in the dark. One of them pointed at her, laughing. Her hands clenched around the keys, her pride warring with the creeping fear that her empire was beginning to crumble. Inside the cafe, the lilies on each table began to wilt, their once vibrant petals drooping under the harsh overhead lights. Mrs. Harper stared at them for a long moment before turning away, the sound of her heels echoing through the empty space. The air in the cafe felt different that week. The usually bustling White Lily was quiet, nearly empty, with only a handful of customers occupying the tables scattered across the room. The once steady hum of conversation was replaced by uncomfortable silences, as though even the walls themselves knew of the storm brewing outside. Mrs. Harper stood behind the counter, her face a mask of icy control, though her eyes betrayed the turmoil that raged inside her. The viral article had started an unstoppable chain reaction. By the end of the week, Miriam's evidence, bolstered by David's investigation and Evelyn's legal expertise, had turned into a full-blown public outcry. The city was no longer indifferent. The voices of the people were demanding accountability. Mrs. Harper's world was unraveling. Suppliers called, expressing their discomfort with the recent attention and politely backing away from future contracts. Longtime clients canceled reservations, and even the few loyal regulars seemed to vanish. The once elegant cafe was slowly falling apart, and Mrs. Harper felt the foundation of everything she had built begin to crumble beneath her. One morning, as she unlocked the doors of the cafe, Mrs. Harper noticed something different, something that sent a chill through her entire body. A notice had been posted to the door, the large red letters demanding her attention. Notice of lease violation and termination. The seal of Miriam Williams's property management company adorned the bottom. Mrs. Harper stared at the paper, her hand trembling slightly. She yanked the notice off the door, her heart pounding, her face flushed with anger. Who was Miriam Williams to threaten her? Who was she to disrupt her life, her business, just because of one incident? She stormed into the cafe, slamming the door behind her. She could feel her composure slipping away as the stress and pressure of the past few weeks caught up with her. The cafe, once her pride, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in, its silence mocking her. Meanwhile, across town, Miriam and Evelyn were meeting to discuss the next steps. They sat in Evelyn's office, the table between them covered in documents and folders filled with testimonies and evidence. "She's already received the notice of lease termination," Evelyn said, flipping through her notes. "But I doubt she'll go quietly. People like her often fight until the very end." Miriam nodded. She knew Evelyn was right. Mrs. Harper wasn't the kind of person who would simply accept defeat. Her arrogance would drive her to resist until there was nothing left. "What do you think she'll do?" Miriam asked, her gaze focused on Evelyn. Evelyn paused for a moment, considering. "She may try to challenge the legality of the lease termination. She'll claim it's retaliatory, that we're targeting her unjustly. But we have enough evidence to prove a pattern of behavior which should hold up in court." Miriam took a deep breath. She had come too far to back down now. She had seen firsthand what Mrs. Harper's behavior had done to her son, and she had heard the stories of others who had suffered in silence. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about standing up for everyone who had been made to feel less than, who had been pushed aside by someone who thought they were superior. Days passed, and the tension in the White Lily only grew worse. Mrs. Harper had hired a lawyer determined to fight the termination of her lease and had filed a petition in court. She was convinced she could still salvage her business, that she could somehow weather the storm. But with each passing day, the reality of her situation became more apparent. The cafe was nearly empty now, with only a few customers here and there, mostly curious onlookers who had heard about the controversy and wanted to see it for themselves. The staff moved through their tasks with mechanical precision, their faces tired and wary, as though they were waiting for the inevitable. Mrs. Harper, for her part, tried to keep up appearances. She forced herself to smile at the customers, to act as though everything was normal, but deep down, she knew the truth. The cafe was dying, and there was nothing she could do to save it. One afternoon, as Mrs. Harper was going over the books in her office, the door to the cafe burst open. She looked up, startled, as two men in dark suits entered, their expressions grim. "Mrs. Harper?" one of them said, stepping forward. "Yes," she replied, her voice faltering. The man handed her an envelope. "You've been served," he said simply. Mrs. Harper's heart sank as she took the envelope, her hands trembling. She opened it, her eyes scanning the legal language that filled the page. It was a lawsuit. Miriam Williams was suing her for discrimination and damages. The words blurred as Mrs. Harper's vision swam, her chest tightening. She had known this was a possibility, but seeing it in writing made it real in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was being held accountable, and for the first time she realized just how precarious her situation was. That night, Mrs. Harper sat in her empty cafe, the lights dimmed, her head in her hands. The once thriving business she had built from the ground up was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She thought back to the beginning, to when she had first opened the White Lily. She had been so proud, so certain that her vision of exclusivity and elegance would succeed. And it had, for a time. She had built a reputation, attracted the city's elite, and had become a symbol of sophistication. But somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. She had become consumed by her own sense of superiority, convinced that her way was the only way. And now, that arrogance was costing her everything. As she sat there, the door to the cafe creaked open, and Mrs. Harper looked up to see a familiar face. Carlos Fernandez stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. Carlos took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I heard about the lawsuit," he said quietly. "I wanted to see for myself if it was true." Mrs. Harper swallowed, her throat dry. "It's true," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Carlos nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "You know, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady, "I worked for you for 2 years. I gave everything I had, and you treated me like I was nothing. And now you're the one losing everything." Mrs. Harper looked away, her eyes stinging. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to remain in control, but now she felt anything but strong. Carlos took another step forward, his gaze softening. "I'm not here to gloat," he said. "I'm here to tell you that this doesn't have to be the end. You can change, Mrs. Harper. You can be better." Mrs. Harper met his eyes, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe him, to believe that there was still a chance for redemption, but she didn't know if she had the strength to try. Carlos turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Mrs. Harper alone once more. She stared after him, his words echoing in her mind. For the first time in a long time, Mrs. Harper felt a flicker of something. Something that felt like hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to make her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to rebuild not her business but herself. In the following days, the cafe continued to lose business. Mrs. Harper's lawyer informed her that the court date for the lawsuit had been set, and Miriam Williams showed no signs of backing down. The reality of her situation was inescapable. The staff began to leave, one by one, seeking work elsewhere as the cafe's future became more uncertain. Mrs. Harper couldn't blame them. She knew they deserved better than the environment she had created. One afternoon, as she stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the polished wood, she heard the soft chime of the doorbell. She looked up to see Miriam Williams standing in the doorway, her expression calm but resolute. Mrs. Harper felt a rush of emotions, anger, fear, regret, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Miriam stepped forward, her eyes meeting Mrs. Harper's. "I'm here to tell you that this is your last chance," she said. "You can either fight this in court and lose everything, or you can do the right thing. Step down and let this place become something better." Mrs. Harper swallowed, her throat tight. She knew Miriam was right. She had lost the respect of her employees, her customers, and her community. There was no salvaging the White Lily as it was, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to make amends. After a long moment, Mrs. Harper nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll step down." Miriam nodded, her expression softening slightly. "It's the right choice," she said. "This place can still be something good, something that brings people together instead of pushing them away." Mrs. Harper closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She had lost her business, but maybe, in the process, she had found a chance to become someone better. As Miriam turned and left the cafe, Mrs. Harper stood alone, the weight of her decision settling over her. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose, a desire to change, to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A few weeks had passed since Mrs. Harper agreed to step down, and the White Lily was no more. The sign above the entrance had been taken down, replaced by a simple one reading Community Haven. The cafe, once a place of exclusivity, was transforming into a new kind of space, a community center dedicated to helping the youth, celebrating diversity, and offering opportunities to those who had once been overlooked. Miriam Williams stood in the middle of the newly renovated space, her eyes taking in the changes that had already been made. Gone were the ornate chandeliers and high-backed chairs that had made the cafe feel so imposing. Instead, the room was now open and welcoming, with colorful murals painted by local artists adorning the walls. Round tables with mismatched chairs filled the floor, inviting conversation and community. The opening day was fast approaching, and Miriam felt both excitement and a hint of nerves. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that this new space would be everything the White Lily had never been, a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel welcomed and valued. Jaden walked in, his face lighting up as he looked around. His mother had told him about her plans for the new center, but seeing it with his own eyes made it real. He felt a sense of pride in what his mother had accomplished. What had begun as an act of defiance had turned into something so much more, something transformative. "Mom," he called, waving as he made his way over. "It looks amazing." Miriam turned, her smile warm, as she pulled Jaden into a hug. "Ah, thank you, sweetheart. I couldn't have done it without everyone's help." Jaden nodded, looking around at the volunteers who had gathered to put the finishing touches on the space. Former employees of the White Lily were here, as well as members of the community who had heard about the transformation and wanted to be part of something meaningful. People were painting, arranging furniture, and hanging signs that read messages like, "All are welcome," and "Community begins with us." One of the volunteers, Carlos Fernandez, approached Miriam, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We've got the kitchen set up," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "It's not as fancy as before, but it'll do the job." Miriam laughed. "Fancy was never the goal," she replied. "As long as we can make good food and good memories, that's all that matters." Carlos nodded, glancing over at Jaden. "You should be proud of your mom, kid. She's doing something really important here." Jaden smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "I know, she's the best." Miriam ruffled his hair, her heart swelling with emotion. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the faces of those who had come to help. There was Monica, working with a group of young people to set up a reading nook. Anna, who had once feared losing her job under Mrs. Harper's watch, was now leading a group of volunteers as they assembled a bookshelf. This was what the White Lily could have been, Miriam thought, if only it had been built on compassion instead of arrogance. The grand opening day of Community Haven dawned bright and clear, and the center was filled with excitement. People from all walks of life came to see what the new space had to offer. There were parents with their children, elderly neighbors curious to see what all the buzz was about, and young people looking for a place to call their own. The air was filled with laughter and conversation, the kind of energy that made Miriam feel hopeful for the future. Jaden was busy helping at the lemonade stand, his eyes wide with excitement as he served drinks to visitors. He loved seeing people smile, knowing that this place was different from the exclusion and coldness he had felt when he had walked into the White Lily that fateful day. A small stage had been set up in one corner of the room, and Miriam took her place at the microphone. She looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with emotion. She saw so many familiar faces, people who had supported her, who had believed in her vision, and who had come to celebrate this moment. "Thank you all for being here today," Miriam began, her voice steadied despite the lump in her throat. "When we first started this journey, it was out of a desire to make a difference, to create a place where everyone feels valued and welcomed." She paused, her gaze drifting to Jaden, who was watching her with a proud smile on his face. "This space is not just about coffee or food. It's about community. It's about making sure that no one feels like they don't belong. Every single one of you is a part of this, and I am so grateful for your support." Applause erupted from the crowd, and Miriam stepped back, her heart full. The band that had volunteered to play began their set, and the room filled with music, the beat lively and hopeful. People began to dance, children running around and laughing, their joy infectious. Carlos made his way to Miriam, handing her a cup of freshly brewed coffee. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his cup. "New beginnings," Miriam echoed, clinking her cup against his. As the day went on, people explored the different areas of the community center. The reading nook was filled with children listening to a volunteer read stories, their eyes wide with wonder. In another corner, local artists displayed their work, showcasing the talent that thrived in the neighborhood. The kitchen bustled with activity, volunteers serving food to those who needed it, no questions asked. Monica approached Miriam, a smile on her face. "I wanted to thank you, Miriam," she said, "for giving me a place where I can make a difference. It means a lot." Miriam's eyes softened. "No, Monica, thank you. You and everyone here have made this possible. This is our space, our community." Monica nodded, her eyes misting. It's amazing to see what we can do when we come together." Jaden ran over, excitement in his voice. "Mom, can I go help Carlos in the kitchen? He said he'd show me how to make empanadas." Miriam laughed, ruffling his hair. "Of course, sweetheart. Just be careful, okay?" Jaden nodded eagerly, running off to the kitchen, his laughter echoing through the room. That evening, as the sun began to set, the energy in Community Haven remained vibrant. People lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth and joy of the space. The band played their final song, and the room erupted in applause, the cheers echoing off the walls. Miriam stood near the entrance, watching as people slowly began to filter out, each one stopping to thank her or share a kind word. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a sense that what they had created was something truly meaningful. As the last of the visitors left, the volunteers gathered in the center of the room, their faces flushed with exhaustion, but their eyes bright. Carlos clapped his hands together, a wide grin on his face. "I think that was a success, don't you?" The group cheered, and Miriam smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you all," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Anna stepped forward, her smile shy. "You gave us all a second chance, Miriam, and now we get to give that same chance to others." Miriam nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "That's the goal," she said, "to make sure everyone knows they're valued, that they have a place." The volunteers began to clean up, laughter and conversation filling the space as they worked. Miriam watched them, her heart full. She had lost so much, but in the process, she had gained something far more meaningful, something that couldn't be measured in profits or prestige. Jaden ran over, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, today was the best day ever," he said, throwing his arms around her. Miriam hugged him tightly, her eyes misting. "I'm glad you think so, sweetheart," she said softly. And this is just the beginning." As the lights dimmed and the volunteers began to leave, Miriam stood in the middle of Community Haven, her heart full of hope for what was to come. The cafe had once been a place of exclusion, of superiority, but now it was a place of belonging, of connection. And that, she knew, was worth everything. This was their community, their haven, and it was only the beginning.